All right. Well, we are in 1 Corinthians 10. We just barely got into a little bit of chapter 10 last week. We'll go back and look especially at the first 4 verses to help us remember about this section and what it's trying to teach us. Would someone first of all start by reading for us the first 4 verses? First 4 verses of 1 Corinthians 10.
Moreover, brethren, I would that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
Well, these first 4 verses are a sermon in and of themselves, but notice the word moreover. That's in the New King James. The King James has 4. That's the connecting word from what he had just been talking about. And so there's a connection there between the two. He had talked about at the very end of chapter 9 how Christians have to discipline themselves. They have to possess self-control over their, the appetites, the passions of the flesh, and keep them under control. And so what he has here, he mentions, I don't want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All right, of course, now we're going back to the time of Moses, the time that God led Moses to lead the people, the new nation of Israel, as they were becoming a new nation out of Egyptian slavery. They were led, as he says, in the cloud and in the sea. Of course, God was directing them, in the cloud represented his presence. As they passed through the sea, it says they were baptized. And the idea is they were surrounded, on all sides. The top, bottom, and sides. They were all surrounded. And of course, that's the idea of being baptized. They were overwhelmed all around. They were buried, if you will, in that sense. So, and of course, you go back to Exodus, 13 and 14 and talks about this thing happening. So they were overwhelmed. They were baptized. They were immersed. They were buried unto Moses or into Moses. And that was because God was the one that was providing this miraculous deliverance from slavery and bondage. And of course, that's what baptism is today. It's a burial, it's an immersion, it's an overwhelming, and it's all done because God miraculously delivers us from the bondage of sin. You go back to Romans chapter 6, talks about how we are buried into his death, Christ's death. And so we have this same idea back in the time of Moses. And so this idea of an immersion is so critical to understanding what it is for us today too. And so by being baptized into Moses, those Israelites were placed into a special relationship with Moses. Moses became their leader. He was their deliverer. And of course, when we're baptized today, we're baptized into a new relationship. We come out, again, like Romans 6, 3 and 4 talks about, we walk in newness of life. We're a new creature, a new creation. And we have, when we're baptized, we have a new relationship with Christ. He's our leader. He's our deliverer. He's our Messiah, which is the idea of deliverer. And so we have this new relationship. And so the Israelites were not saved until they passed through the sea, until they were immersed. All right? Same way with us today. We're not saved or delivered from our sins until we are immersed in water, until we are buried with him in water. So, You go back to 1 Peter 3:21. The like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us. So there's a lot of similarities, type and antitype, between what happened then and what happens to us today. So then 3 and 4 talks about they all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink. All right, and of course the Israelites, when they were in the wilderness, they were fed miraculously with manna from heaven. They didn't have to do anything but gather it up each day. That's all they had to do. They didn't, have to plant or reap or anything. They just gathered it up. God gave it to them miraculously. They didn't deserve it by any means, but God gave it to them. And so that manna was spiritual food for them in the sense of God gave it to them miraculously. And so, let's see, would someone, because this goes right along with it, would someone turn to John 6 and read verses 31 through 35? This references the idea of manna and what God has done. John 6, 31 through 35.
Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written. He gave them bread out of heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, always give us this bread. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will certainly not cast out.
Okay, so there we have that analogy again between what happened in the wilderness and what happens today. All right? Jesus is our manna from heaven. Just like they got physical manna from heaven, Jesus says now He is the bread of life. He is the one that gives us spiritual food. Well, in the same sense, it says they all drank the same spiritual drink. Remember, they were thirsty in the wilderness, and God through Moses gave them miraculous water out of a rock 2 different times. One kind of near the beginning, if I remember right, of their wanderings, and one more toward the end. But the same thing. They had this water miraculously. They didn't do anything to deserve the water. God gave it to them miraculously. Water doesn't normally come miraculously out of a rock. Well, Jesus, for us, is the water of life. He talks about that very thing. Now, would someone read John 4, verse 14?
But whosoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become to him a fountain of water springing up from everlasting life. All
right. Again, there's that analogy. Now, the people back then, they would get thirsty again. But what Jesus gives us, that spiritual water, as He says, shall never thirst. He says, I shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. So, there's a lot of analogies there. Well, Paul is going to continue with giving some examples about what happened then and what we have to learn from it. So verse 5 says, but with most of them God was not well pleased. Not well pleased. How many people survived out of that original group of adults? How many people were allowed? 2. That's it. Joshua and Caleb. So when he says, but with most of them God was not well pleased, almost the absolute, all of them, there was over 600,000 adults that left. 2 of them, were the only ones God was pleased with. Well, that's a pretty tiny percentage. I don't know what percentage that is, but it's pretty small. So they rebelled. It says, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And of course, that they were left in the wilderness. They did not make it into the promised land. Again, it was just Joshua and Caleb. So we kind of have a similar thing today in the sense, toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, the gate is very narrow and constricted. The way that leads to eternal life is very narrow. Very few find it. Well, there's a similarity to what happened to the Israelites. Most of that first generation, okay, not the kids, but the adults, out of those, only 2. So that was a very narrow way for them. So again, a tiny remnant. You go to the Old Testament a lot and you see that word remnant. Especially the prophets, they talk a lot about a remnant, a small amount. When we talk about a remnant of a garment, just a small amount. Well, the Bible talks about that a lot. So he says, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Now he starts giving lots of different examples. This comes from Numbers chapter 11. Would someone read from Numbers 11, verses 33 and 34? Well, you probably should read verse 4 and then go to 33 and 34. Numbers 11, first verse 4, and then verses 33 and 34.
Okay, I'm just about there.
Okay?
Numbers 11.
Yeah, first of all, verse 4, and then 33 and 34.
And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and said, who shall give us flesh to eat?
Mm-hmm. And then 33 and 34.
And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord smote the people with a very great plague, and he called the name of that place Gibrath Hava, because there they buried the people that lusted.
All right, so there's the example he's referring to. All right, so he says we have, and he's going to give a lot of examples. There's one example right there. That was to teach us a lesson. So we're supposed to learn from that. That's why the Old Testament is so vitally important. We're supposed to learn from it. Now, that's why we still have it today, because we're supposed to learn from it. So it's not there just to fill up space, in other words, to make our Bibles thick. No, there's purposes to it. Well, verse 7, he gives us some more. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We know about the golden calf they made while Moses was on the mountain. Aaron was down with the people, and what did they do? They became idolaters. All right, they built up this golden calf and started worshiping it. Exodus 32. So there's an example again of what they are talking about. They sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. See, they were forgetting God. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. This idea of play there in verse 7 has the idea of some of these dances that they would do before idols that were immoral. So that's a lot of people to die in one day, but they knew better. It wasn't that they were ignorant. They knew what they were doing was wrong. And so as a result, 23,000 of them died. And that was in one day. The total that died was 24,000. When we look further, there was another 1,000 that died from it later. But one day, there was 23,000. So They saw what happened. The others saw what happened to them. So here's another example, verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. And again, we go to, this was in Numbers 21, and then Numbers 16 also. But we have this account where they tempted God. They were, God had told them what they needed to do, but their disposition, their attitude toward Moses, which was God's representative, and then toward God, they were like making a trial of Moses, and they were seeing, and a lot of people do the same thing even today. They were kind of seeing how close to the edge they could get before they fell off. That's tempting God. That's the kind of attitude some of these people had. And, they were destroyed by serpents. And again, you can go back to Numbers 21 and see God sent, I think the Bible calls them fiery serpents, destroying many of them. And then complaining. Verse 10, nor complained as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Of course, they complained lots of times. All right, there were lots of times that people complained. Remember one time they hadn't been on their wilderness wanderings very long when they started complaining about, man, we had it better back in Egypt. We had better food back in Egypt, or we had a better life back in Egypt. Well, they had forgotten about how bad things were in Egypt, and so many of them were destroyed again. So lots of examples from this 40-year period of wandering that Paul is telling the church at Corinth, you need to learn from this. Being about idolaters, being immoral, being complainers or murmurers, all of these things, building idols, so lusting. So there's a lot of examples here. He says you need to be aware of. Because he says, and this kind of sums it up, verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples. And they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So they were written so, first of all, so the people then would learn from it. Look what God thinks about idolatry. Look at what God thinks about complaining, and on and on and on. Look at what God considers, how He considers them when you tempt Him, when you try Him. Again, complaining, murmuring. But they were also written for our admonition, because we need admonishing. All right, we need to be admonished in times. Because, he says, the ends of the ages have come upon us. I hadn't thought about that until this week. That's a really significant phrase. That means we're the last age of this world. The end of the ages. This is the last age. We've had ages before us that ended, and we got a new age. The patriarchal age, well, it came to an end, and then we had the Mosaical age, and it came to an end on the cross. Now, we are today in the end of the ages. This is the last age. There are not going to be any more ages upon this earth, because, of course, it's going to be destroyed. There's not going to be any more ages. This is it. When Christ returns, this age ends. It's going to be over. There's not going to be any more world. You go 2 Peter 3 toward the end talks all about that. How this world's going to be burned up, going to come to an end. It's our last period. He says, because of that, 12, notice the first word, therefore. Because of all of these examples, because of all these things that's happened, he says, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No doubt, many of those people back in the wilderness thought they were safe, in the sense of they could do whatever they wanted and God's grace would overlook it and everything would be fine. Well, they soon learned that was not the case. That was not the case at all. So God, destroyed so many people. In one case it says the earth swallowed them up. And so all kinds of examples were there for them to learn from and from us to learn from. So anybody who thinks he stands, in other words, there's this proud arrogance, and this, when I think about this verse, I think about the people who believe in once saved, always saved. Because that's basically what they believe. That they're standing and so they can never fall. Period. They can never fall. But this is a warning to everyone who thinks that. Because just because you're standing doesn't mean you can't fall, because you can. I mean, I don't know how many verses in the New Testament talk about how someone can lose their salvation. But over and over and over again. You can practically go to every book in the New Testament. Falling is severe. If falling wasn't a big deal, then verse 12 wouldn't be in the Bible. If falling wasn't a big deal, if it wasn't possible for someone to fall and lose their salvation, then why did Paul, by inspiration, include all of these examples about people falling and losing their life? Well, the whole point is that you can fall and lose your salvation. You can. So, you can lose it. Eternal condemnation. So, it is a big deal. And so we'll end with verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. God doesn't want us to give in to temptation, but because of how He made us, He has always given us a way of escape. 1 John 2 talks about the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life, and how those can tempt us. Jesus was tempted similarly. The Hebrew writer talks about how Jesus was tempted in every way just like us, yet without sin. So throughout the Bible we're reminded of that very thing. It's not wrong to be tempted at all, because Jesus was tempted. It is only wrong when we give in to it. That's when it becomes sin. And of course, that's how the first half of the first chapter of James talks about it. But there's a promise here that God will not allow us to be tempted in such a way that we can avoid resisting it. There will always be a way to resist it. I mean, He's promised that. That's an absolute promise. And so He'll always give us, as He calls it, a way of escape so that we can bear it, or so that we can endure it. Maybe is a good synonym for that. So regardless of the type of temptation, we have this guarantee, this absolute promise that there's always a way to not give in to it. But God knows we will give in to temptations. 1 John 1 talks about that, and that's what our sermon is about today. He knows we will give in to temptation. But He always gives us an opportunity not to. That's the guarantee. That's the promise. And it is probably one of the greatest promises in the Bible. Well, Lord willing, next week we're going back to idolatry, like He's talked about before, because it was a huge problem in the city of Corinth.